Stephen Taylor, Tess Brad, Tess and Brad and Stephen noticed the silence at hand. Back in the beer bartending area, the lights were dimmed and the lights were going in and out. Tess looks at Brad and says, "Shit." Brad stares at Tess. Stephen seems bewildered about the situation and grabs the lamp and breaks it on the table and fixes the lamp up as a holster to stab somebody with by breaking each end of the lamp and then quarantining the ends to make it pointy as he can to prepare to stab somebody with it in case of an emergency. Brad pulls out his gun and pulls the cock chamber and prepares the chamber, takes it off of safety, and points it one-handedly down the corridor. Tess stares at the end of the corridor. The two brothers and their male friend walk down the hallway into the lightly dimmed corridor. Brad and Tess walk in front of Stephen Taylor. Brad gives Tess Mitch a flashlight and he shines it down the hallway, noticing that the bartender area was empty, holding it up with one hand. But to Tess's amusement, he notices that Ted and Carlina were dead. Tess runs ahead of Brad and breaks Brad's holsters behind, and notices that there was no cold and Mitch at the scene of the crime. Tess looks at the broken glass door, but nobody's home. Ted and Carlina's body, which dead on the ground, was just left for the spare rot. Tess turns around swiftly in a 180-degree angle, looks down the corridor and sees no Stephen Taylor. The lights go out in the whole entire film studio, except for the main action light turns on in the main room. Brad switches angles of his 9mm Beretta toward back down the end of the corridor, and Tess walks ahead of Mitch. Stephen, however, snuck up behind and scared the two from behind. Brad and Tess Melcy scream behind, and the 9mm Beretta is directly at Stephen Taylor's head. And Stephen responds, "Dude, are you going to kill me? Or are you going to stand there?" Brad holsters the gun to his and puts it to the side of his legs softly. Just as Ghostface enters the room and punches Stephen Taylor directly against their torso, knocking him out instantly, and then uses a knife and nearly stabs Tess Mitch in the skull, in which Tess Mitch obviously avoids the attack, and falls onto his head, and then runs down the corridor toward the action light area. Brad and Tess, however, during the chase, get separated, in which Brad Mitch loses his gun and ends up within a glass window chamber. Tess Mitch trips over a piece of film equipment and knocks himself out on the floor. Turns around and looks at the ceiling in a daze. Brad turns around within the window-style corridor and runs down the corridor again. However, this time Ghostface breaks through the glass window with a gun in his hand. Brad avoids the bullet by grabbing the gun and pushing the gun out of the way, forced Ghostface to waste another bullet. Ghostface then pulls out his knife and attempts to stab Brad in the head. However, Brad, who was in a situation he couldn't get out of, couldn't hold the gun and then keep himself from being killed by Ghostface via the gun and the knife at the same time. So he takes a stab and a shot in the dark and keeps himself from being stabbed in the face by a knife. That's when Ghostface makes the alternative decision to knock him in the side of the head with the side of the gun, slide dipping with the gun on empty, and knocked him out onto the floor.